Time for another edition of Survival Stuff with Indiana Jim, sponsored by Live Free USA at AmericanSurvivor.org. I am James C. Jones, and I do live in Indiana, but Indiana Jones was taken. Live Free USA is America's oldest and most respected survival and preparedness establishment, basically set up in 1968 to promote and educate for survival and family preparedness. We are a nonprofit, tax-deductible organization, supported only by memberships and contributions. Today, we're going to go back to 1968 in a way, because when we formed this organization back in the 60s, nuclear war was the main driving force behind preparedness and the kind of things that we came to represent as an organization. But the main thing then was nuclear war. Over the years, we worked in those years, we worked with the civil defense departments. We often became radiological monitors. We worked with the local civil defense. We actually built, Live Free members actually dug primitive improvised fallout shelters in those days for the Civil Defense Department to show how it was done. We were involved a lot in those kind of things. But then as we got into the 90s and the Cold War faded away, everybody got complacent. Civil defense, as we knew it then, became FEMA, and FEMA basically concentrated on storms and terrorism and a lot of things that needed to be focused on, but they completely lost their focus on nuclear war scenarios. In fact, all of the shelters that used to be stocked with water and medical supplies and food, all those kind of things. In fact, the back behind me, there's a fallout shelter sign. You don't see many of those around nowadays. They used to be on all the buildings. There were fallout shelters. All of the civil defense preparations that existed in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s at least, they're all gone. We don't really have a civil defense for nuclear war in America at all. We're pretty much on our own, which is sad. By the way, the Russians and the Chinese have a robust civil defense program. They still have deep shelters, deep tunnels. They have training. They have all of the civil defense for nuclear war to protect their citizens that we no longer have, which is a scary thing in itself to realize that they're prepared and we're not. At any rate, here we are at this stage in the years and decades that Live Free organizations existed. Here we are focusing back on nuclear war survival. By the way, I'm going to be only able to cover some real basics and some real outlines here. There's a lot more on our website at AmericanSurvivor.org, and there will continue to be more stuff on nuclear war survival on our website. There's articles in our American Survivor newsletter, which is the newsletter that our members get when they join Live Free USA. They get the newsletter and they get to download the back issues. So those are another area you can find information on. There's also more in my books, which are published by Skyhorse Publishing. James C. Jones, go to Skyhorse Publishing, you'll see some of my books. Even though some of those books were written 4, 5, 6 years ago, I did cover nuclear war survival information in those books. So I've never really lost focus on this subject, but most people did. A couple of the books that are still available out there, if you go look for them, that were very popular back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Better Read Than Dead, read meaning R-E-A-D. Now there was also a slogan, Better Dead Than Red, which was that we'd rather deal with a nuclear war than become a communist country. And I still feel that way, by the way. But this is a book by T.F. Newman. It's basically a lot of government shelter information, how to protect yourself in various ways from the blast effects and from the fallout. And fallout was one of the main focuses. We'll talk about both blast and fallout effects later. And then another book that was in it, I believe it's still in print, Nuclear War Survival Skills. Nuclear War Survival Skills. by Kirsten Kearney, which was, again, he was kind of employed by the Civil Defense Department to do the research on how to survive and all kinds of improvised ventilation systems, improvised radiation fallout meters, all the kinds of things that you could do for some basic first aid, what you should store away. A lot of those kind of things were in this book, and it's the foreword is by Edward Teller, who was the father of the hydrogen bomb. And by the way, I met Edward Teller when I spoke at a civil defense convention in Las Vegas many, many years ago. He was, quite an interesting character to talk to, but he was actually part of the Manhattan Project and helped develop the hydrogen bomb. So anyhow, we're going to talk a little bit about nuclear war survival and the fact that it is survivable. One of the important things we have to see is that the opportunities for a nuclear war are actually more today than they were back in the old Cold War days. Because in the old Cold War days, we had what we called mutually assured destruction. And that was that the Russians, and we only had the Russians then, we didn't have to worry about the Chinese, we didn't have to worry about all these rogue nations with nuclear weapons that we have to worry about today. The Russians were very careful with their nuclear weapons. But mutually assured destruction, and for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, basically meant that when they fire their missiles, we'll see them coming, we'll fire our missiles, they'll pass each other on the way down, and we're both obliterated. So there was no win in that. There was no win in that at all. Unfortunately now, we have a new situation. We have hypersonic missiles with multiple warheads. What that means is that you fire your missiles first, and they're so fast that these guys, the receiver never gets to fire his defensive missiles or his counteroffensive missiles. So as a result, who shoots first wins, which is a really frightening scenario. And as we know, Russia is in the hands of a much more unstable government than it was back during the communist days. The communists were very careful that you had to go through 3 or 4 different people to certify and check and double check before they fired or messed around with any nuclear weapons. So how could a nuclear war start nowadays? Okay, we already have. I can't write these articles fast enough to keep up with current events. One of the first stage would be a protracted conventional war that spreads into a larger conventional war. We've got one of those going on right now. That's a concentrated conventional type war with tanks and guns and bombs and that kind of thing. But it could spread easily into a larger conventional war, maybe involving all of Europe. It could be with the Chinese and Taiwan. Could be anything. It's a lot of different scenarios. And then that could, somebody gets desperate and they got to break the stalemate. They got to get, go beyond this. Everybody's locked up in a stalemate, and somebody gets desperate and they use a limited tactical nuclear weapon or some several tactical nuclear weapons, and now you've got this small nuclear war going within that region. In fact, a lot of military people, this happened 20, 30 years ago, we started hearing that they regarded tactical nuclear weapons as conventional warfare, okay? Now, I don't think it's conventional, but that's the mindset, especially in Russia and China, that all tactical nuclear weapons are no different than just big bombs. Scary, right? Then you might get a full exchange of tactical nuclear weapons, but still limited to the battlefield. So maybe 1 or 2, and then boom, 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 and then the whole area there is but they're still tactical. It's still one area. You're going to get fallout from those. You're still going to have to deal with those fallout and all the other side effects of a nuclear war going on, but you're not going to have to deal with the blast here. But then stage 4, a limited nuclear attack aimed at the enemy's government structure and military bases. So let's say that the Russians decide, well, we're going to hit America's main military bases to send a message that they better back off and let us take over Europe or whatever. Or the Chinese decide to hit some of our Pacific naval bases, another Pearl Harbor per se, to prevent us from stopping us from taking over Taiwan and controlling the China Sea. That could happen. Okay, so we're one stage closer to a full-scale nuclear war. And then, of course, stage 5, we respond, they respond, boom, boom, boom. We could go right to stage 5 in some cases, but that's a full-scale nuclear war where they are hitting all of our cities, we're hitting all their cities. Civilians are dying in millions and millions at a time. So we're much more in a scenario now where either by stages or all at once, we could have a nuclear war. Sorry to say this, I really hate to say this. Here I am all these years later back with this scenario. So, back in the Cold War days, when we talked about this kind of stuff, and some of you may be out there now hearing this and getting the same mindset. The first thing we talked about was a Titanic syndrome. This was that when we were talking about how to survive a nuclear war, we heard a lot of people say, well, I can't survive it. It's unsurvivable. We're all going to die. And so they weren't going to do any preparedness. They weren't going to learn how to prepare. They weren't going to learn how to deal with fallout or anything like that. They just didn't do anything. It was basically a kind of a cop-out. And our argument was, yeah, but what if you do survive? You know, oh, what if you miscalculated? Oh, I know I was going to die anyhow, so I wasn't going to waste time preparing, but oh, my gosh, I'm still alive, okay? Now what do? I'm not prepared. So now you become a desperate, dangerous person, basically, in your community. The second attitude that we ran into was, this is so horrible that I don't want to survive. And our argument to that was, sure, after it goes off, after the bombs go off and the infrastructure is destroyed and there's no electricity and there's people running around all panicked and there's no food and water, whatever, you are going to be the most dangerous SOB on the planet because you did survive, but you didn't prepare. So now you're in a different world and you're willing to kill anybody that gets in your way. So that's both of those is in our concept. The way we looked at it was a cop-out. It was a form of denial. It's a form of civic irresponsibility. So that was what we had. And our personal philosophy, the philosophy that our organization had, was basically that if you should prepare, and if you do survive, even if you're injured or whatever, you can help your neighbors, and you'll be able to survive, and you'll be able to help rebuild the society in the world that, yes, will be much less comfortable than it was before the nuclear war. Nevertheless, to us, it was a responsibility to help people prepare for even this level of danger, okay? So, yeah, so our attitude was always that preparedness provides hope, and it is the responsibility of every good citizen, regardless of the threat scenario, to be as well prepared as they can be. Now, let's talk about surviving a nuclear war in general. Now, there's two aspects to it. You have to survive the blast effects if you're close enough. Now, if you live in downtown Chicago, your chances are slim. But there are things that could happen that you could still survive. You always have to consider the possibility that you'll survive. The war may be limited to limited combat zones, in which case, as I mentioned, you'll only have to deal with fallout. Okay. If you live in small towns or far out suburbs, again, your house may burn down, or you may be subject to, radiation. You may be subject to fires and all kinds of other terrible things, but you're alive, and now your preparedness is going to help you stay alive. You maybe happen to be aware, maybe you live in a target area, but you're away that day, or you're on vacation, or something like that. Another thing that means that you may have to use your nuclear war survival skills. You may have followed the first rule of survival. And my 10 principles of survival, the first one is anticipate. You may have been watching the news. You may have been keeping a real close eye on everything going on in the world. And you may have said, I think this is going to happen. I need to get the hell out of here now. And you may have had a plan. You've made a plan. You're going to visit your uncle in a little town in downstate Indiana, or your campground that you've staked out, or whatever you've prepared, and you've got all your pack, you've got the stuff in your car, and you got out of town before the big rush and the traffic was all backed up. So it's another scenario where the nuclear war happened, you're still alive, okay? You may be outside, you may live outside the zone in the first place. Those of you that I'm talking to here, you may already live outside of a target zone. You may not live next to a government installation, a military base, a large population center like Chicago or New York or Los Angeles. If you live in one of those areas, all of this information that I'm giving you is going to be critical. Because, I lived in an urban area for a long time, but I'd go on trips and I'd like, look at this little town here, this little town. Nobody's going to bomb this little town, that little town. These are all going to be here. All these people are going to be here, but they're still going to have to cope with fallout. They're going to cope with the fact that the infrastructure and the electrical systems and law and order and all those other things went to hell. They're still going to have survival skills, okay? So all of these kind of things are going to mean that you're going to need to know some of the things that you'll find in books like this, that you'll find in articles on our American Survivor website, in an survivor.org website, and in American Survivor newsletter. So, what are equipment that you're going to need? And I've got a little list here. I'm going to give you a few items that you're going to need. But you're going to have only minutes. In the case of you're in the city or you're in a target zone, there's two ways to look at this. If the sirens are going off with hypersonic missiles, you've got 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes to get out of the target zone. So whereas in the old days we had this whole plan on you put this big survival pack on, all this equipment, you'd love to have all that stuff, and if you anticipated and got that out of town fast, good, then you can get that done. But the problem is, within 15, 20 minutes, there's going to be that big flash and all the effects of a nuclear war. And there's only two things that are going to protect you from that: distance and mass, okay? Speed is all you care about. And if the roads are already blocked, there's no sense in being on the highway. You're going to have to take a space blanket. I wrote an article about this. You just got to run, okay? Get as far away from what you think is going to be the center of the target area as you can, as fast as you can. And that means you're not going to be able to carry your big survival pack and all that. You're going to have to carry a knife, a gun, a space blanket backwards so that it'll reflect the heat wave when it comes, a couple of basic items with you, and that's it. So if you're able to establish a cache out of town before, that's great. If you've got your head full of good survival data, that's great, because that doesn't weigh anything more than it does empty. So point being, speed is more important than all your survival gear. So in the case of an emergency and you haven't gotten out of town already, then you're going to have to minimize what you take with you to what you can have in your pockets. Your survival vest maybe, throw that space blanket over you. It can also keep you warm the next night. It can also help fend off, fallout for a while. Until you get to a shelter. And of course, the one thing you're going to want to have with you is N95 masks, because one of the kinds of radiation, the fallout, if you breathe that dust in, the radioactive dust in, it gets into your lungs and it gets into your organs. That is a very serious problem. The N95s properly fitted on your face. You want to have several because, sometimes you'll take it off and you have to put a new one on, keep them in a plastic bag. This is something you want to carry with you. But other than that, and of course you will have these in your survival pack if you were lucky enough to be able to get away ahead of time. So, if it's happening now, you got to get out, minimize your equipment, and run like hell. That's all you can do. Take the fastest way out of town. If you have time and you anticipate that it's going to be a couple hours or half a day, then you can carry your survival pack and get that distance between you. Okay, so take routes. Well, there's, along rivers, along highways, hiking trails would be great. You need to make a plan. How am I going to get out of town? How am I going to get out of the target area as fast as possible if I can't drive, if I can't take my vehicle with me anymore? Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the effects of a nuclear war and of the flash and the explosion of a nuclear weapon. First of all, the things that are going to happen, and I've read descriptions of this kind of thing from people in Japan that went through it. So they felt that tingling, which is actually they're being radiated, okay? So when you get that, first thing you're going to get is a flash. Bright white flash, and hopefully it's behind you, and hopefully you're running, or hopefully maybe you're well out of town and you're in shelters, but there's going to be this big flash. Behind that flash is going to be a heat wave, a tremendous wave of heat. You will survive that or you won't, okay? If you're exposed, you're going to get badly burned, and then you're going to get a bad case of radiation sickness. So if you can when you hear that flash, you hit the dirt. Or you can get behind a wall, or into a culvert, or into a ditch, or if you're nothing else, fall flat with your feet facing the source of the flash. That can save you. And then you pull that, if you got the space blanket, you pull that over you. Because a lot of people, during the bombs that went off in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, those people that were wearing white clothes didn't get burned. Those people that were wearing dark clothes did. Those people who had any kind of clothing over them were burned less than those people who had exposed skin, okay? So that's the flash, and then there's the heat wave, okay? And if you're in the area where the heat wave is setting buildings on fire, you're probably going to be set on fire too. But if you're a little further out, you can prevent yourself from getting severely burned by being duck and cover, okay? The next thing that's going to come behind that is the blast wave or the overpressure wave, and it's going to be a tremendous overpressure wave, carrying debris and all kinds of pieces of glass and everything else, and you'll get struck by that. It's sort of like a tornado. Again, if you're real close in, unfortunately, things are going to, again, if you're not in a shelter, you haven't hit the dirt, you haven't gotten behind something, that's a very big danger. When I was a kid, we did the duck and cover. We ducked under our desk, so we did the siren go off, and siren would go off, and the teacher would tell us all to get under our desks. And everybody laughed at that. Says, well, how the heck is a school desk going to protect you from a nuclear blast? Well, Live Free actually has the films that the Japanese made. They didn't know what the bomb was, but they knew it was something they should record. And there's a lot of pictures of these terribly burned children who were, sitting at their school desk. When the flash came, they looked toward the flash. The heat wave got them next, and they were terribly burned. And then on top of that, the windows broke, and they were terribly cut up. Now, they were far enough away that they weren't incinerated by the fireball. They were far enough away that the blast didn't level their school. But yet they were badly injured and unnecessarily exposed to radiation just because they were sitting at their desk instead of under their desk. So duck and cover does actually work. And you need to remember that when you're running away from the blast area or you're near the blast area, that duck and cover will help. It may or may not make a difference between life or death. I prefer taking that chance, and I would advise you and your children to do the same. So after the blast and after the pressure wave, there'll be a pressure wave back coming the other way. It's like boom. Okay, now there's a vacuum. Boom, and the wind comes back. Then there'll be all this wind, and then that's the one thing you have to survive. And we've talked about getting out of the area. We've talked about taking shelter in emergency and all that kind of thing. So now, the next thing that will happen, especially if you're in a blast area, is fallout. Fallout will start real soon within the immediate area of the blast. And the reason that they'll be in the form of like grains of sand and heavy debris coming down, and if it rains, which it quite often does, the rain will be highly radioactive, okay? And again, the first thing you want to do is be putting on your mask. You also, if you've got a rain poncho or a hoodie or anything like that that you can put over you to keep this radioactive dust and debris off your body, it's very important. And then you'll go whenever you get to a shelter or whatever, you're going to take all that off and get as much of that off of you as you can. And then last thing you're going to do is take your mask off, only when you get in an area where there is no fallout or dust blowing around, because it's very important you keep this out of your body. Talk a little bit, very little bit, about what kinds of radiation there is, and again, these are in the books. You'll have to look at the articles to get more details. Alpha particles. These cannot penetrate the broken skin. Alpha particles is the material that comes from the radiation from the blast. They cannot penetrate unbroken skin. But if they're ingested, inhaled, like in the water, you want to be able to filter your water. If they're inhaled, the fallout, it gets into your lungs and reaches unprotected organs, and then you've got problems, okay? So this is why we've got the N95 respirator, and we want to get that on real quick. Beta particles, these beta particles can land on your skin and they will radiate and they will cause what they call beta burns. Again, if you've got full body covering over your body so that the particles aren't right on your skin, the clothing will protect you from beta burns. Gamma rays, though, which is the most insidious and dangerous of the whole list of radiation, gamma rays will penetrate just like X-rays. So if I've got a radioactive, this is radioactive, and I've got it holding it here, it's still giving out radiation that's going through my body and killing my cells. So this is the most important thing you have to protect yourself against. Now, as you get further away from the blast zone, the fallout will come a little later and it'll be a little finer. It'll be fine dust, particles, but it'll be radioactive. So you have to get into a shelter. It's a significant, like a basement, a deep basement, that kind of thing, a cave, dugout, any kind of thing like that. And you have to put as much material between you and the outside world where all that fallout is landing as possible. And we can't get into the details of how to build shelters and that within this short program. Some signs and symptoms of radiation poisoning, though, is really important. And also it's important to understand that if you don't have a radiation meter or some other device to measure the radiation, and these devices you can still get these things, the batteries are hard to find, you can get the old civil defense ones, the new ones are fairly expensive, but you don't necessarily need that. You know that if a bomb went off upwind to where you're at, fallout is coming on you. So you start, the sooner those symptoms appear, like if those symptoms appear within 24 hours of the blast or your exposure, that's not good. If they appear a little later, it's better. If they appear right away and they're severe, your chances are kind of slim, okay, of survival. Whereas if they appear a week later, you're in pretty good shape. Hopefully they don't appear at all if you did everything right and you were a little bit of luck, okay? So the more time you spend in the shelter, the better. The sooner you get the dust off you, the better. The signs and symptoms, vomiting and diarrhea, okay? The sooner that these symptoms appear, as I said, those were usually the first symptoms. And the sooner those symptoms appear, the lower your survival rate's going to be. I'm going to read a few things out of my article that I think are important to understand that principle, if you'll bear with me a minute. Basically, at acute dose in Roentgens, which is what this device measures, 0 to 50 Roentgens is basically no obvious symptoms. You're going to be fine, not to worry about it. When you get down to 180 to 220, you get vomiting, nausea. This will affect about 50% of the people. So some people won't have symptoms, or 50% of them at that level will start to get vomiting and nausea. And this will usually be within about 1 day. So this will be followed by symptoms of all the symptoms of radiation sickness, but usually no deaths will occur, or very few, maybe people with pre-existing conditions, that we hear about. Okay, but at 270 to 330 roentgens, vomiting, nausea will affect nearly all of the exposed personnel on the first day. When you reach that level, everybody's sick on the first day of exposure. This is a real bad sign. This will be followed by other symptoms of radiation sickness. In other words, hair falling out and all those kind of the things that are happening. Prolonged recovery time for about 20% of the people, and about 20% of the people will die within 2 to 6 weeks. So this is when you get to that level and you see people getting those symptoms within the first day, and those severe symptoms, a lot of those people are not going to make it. We get down to 1,000 roentgens. Vomiting and nausea will affect all exposed personnel within a few hours of exposure. And a few or no people will survive radiation sickness from that. It's almost 100% above 1,000 to between 1,000 and 5,000 roentgens. It's almost 100%. So it's very important that you prevent exposure. It's very important that you'll be able to recognize these things. Now, I mentioned that vomiting and diarrhea is one of the most prominent symptoms. Back in the old days, the fallout shelter had milk of magnesia. There was one of the things that was in the big containers that you were supposed to open up. There was a lot of water in there, and there was a lot of milk of magnesia to prevent diarrhea. To the extent that you can prevent vomiting and diarrhea, because basically what people are going to die of here, if they don't die of sheerly because so many cells were destroyed by the radiation, they will die of dehydration from vomiting and diarrhea and not being able to keep down food and water. So it's very important. It's also important to be able to rehydrate people. We teach in our survival medical classes about how to do IVs, how to use an enema to put moisture into the body when it won't go in one end. We're trying to put it in the other end to keep these people hydrated. Okay. Those are the kind of things you're going to need to do. Now, what to do if you think you've been exposed. Okay, you think you have been exposed. Okay, get out of the area immediately that you think is contaminated. Now, the radiation will blow downwind, so you'll want to go crosswind to get out of that radiation footprint. That's the first thing to do. Put on the dust mask, the N95 mask, as soon as possible. You can also use a damp cloth or a damp, bandana. I talk about bandanas being an essential item you should always have. At least it'll stop some of that from getting into you, because you've got to keep that radioactive material out of you. Dust off all the contaminated clothing. If possible, don a rain suit or a poncho, or even those plastic rain ponchos. This will all keep that radiation up. This should be part of your nuclear war survival kit. This is the kind of thing that you would want to carry with you, even though you have to dump your survival pack. You've got a rain poncho, you've got a dust mask, you have some other things that can protect you and get that radiation off you. Once out of the contaminated area, you want to remove the contaminated outer garments, dust off and wash and spray showers the skin and hair and the feet and shoes particularly and thoroughly as possible. Now, we have, in some cases, we've used through decontamination training the yard hose that you use for spraying yard sprayers for spraying plant insecticides. Well, put a separate one aside. That thing costs $15-20. You can pump them up, you get a lot of pressure. You can use it for putting out small fires. You can use it for biological decontamination, and you can use it for radiological decontamination if you've got one of those handy. So decontaminate all your food cans, your utensils, anything that's been exposed, you're going to want to decontaminate. Don't drink water that's been stored outside, because the same thing, it'll be contaminated with that dust floating in it, okay? If you have available, take potassium iodide pills. You can get these pretty commonly at survival supply stores. This will keep the radiological material from out of your internal organs, particularly your thyroid. So you want to have that. Also, you might want to invest in some antibiotics, because one of the things that fallout will do and radiation exposure will do is it'll knock your immune system out. So you don't die from fallout, you don't die from radiation sickness, you die from some kind of other infections, and there'll be plenty of them around under these conditions. So you can go to your animal supply store, your pet supply store, your fish supply store, or you can go to survival suppliers, and you can get a variety of antibiotics which you want to take prophylactically to prevent infection. And this is penicillin, as it happens to be. Same penicillin for the pets and the fish as it is for humans. It's just in a different container and costs a hell of a lot less. So you want to maintain hydration, you want to maintain vitamins, use the electrolyte fortified water like Gatorade, very important. Strong iron supplements would be very important to help keep you alive and help you under these conditions. Burn and wound ointments you want to have handy to treat those kind of conditions that may happen from being exposed to the blast. Internal bleeding is possible, so I would not advise aspirin, because radiation sickness, one of the things is internal bleeding, and aspirin is a blood thinner, so probably not what you want to be taking. To take another kind of painkiller, but not anything with aspirin in it. And again, milk of magnesia we mentioned, or Pepto-Bismol, to prevent or reduce vomiting and diarrhea. Just a last minute thing to say, radioactive decay, the rule of sevens, declines by a factor of 10 for every 7-fold increase in time, okay? So this is known as the rule of sevens. So after 7 hours, the residual fission radiation declines by 90%. So that first hour, if you're exposed, will really get in the dose. But an hour later, if you've sheltered for an hour, you did yourself some good. It declines to 1/10 after an hour. After 48 hours, the level drops by 90% from the previous level, and so on and so forth. So now you're down to just 48 hours. It's 1% of what it was the first hour. So the longer you're in shelter, sooner you get the radioactive material off you, and the longer you can stay in shelter. So if you got a place where you can, you got enough water, you got enough food, you got some kind of filtered air, you got a lot of mass, above you, like piled books and stuff. In the fallout shelter things, they show about how you can have books and all kinds of things piled on your workbenches. And yeah, you may have to go out for a short time, but then you're going to sleep with a lot of mass around you. You're going to stay in anything that, basement, like I said, a dugout, anything you can do to get material between you and the outside. 2 weeks, you should be in pretty good shape to go out. But if you may have to go out sooner than that, that's okay. But the general rule is 7 days is minimum, 2 weeks optimum, before you go out in the world and start walking around and getting yourself exposed to whatever little bit of radiation is still left out there. And it would still be a great idea to wear your N95 mask, and still be a great idea to decontaminate yourself when you get home. So those are the only things I can give you as a tips for dealing with radiation, fallout, and dealing with the blast effects. Like I say, you can go to AmericanSurvivor.org or subscribe to our newsletter, American Survivor, and get a lot more information on that. So as in the past, we can hope that a nuclear war never happens, but if it does, many of you will survive the initial blast, and we've given you a few tips on how to do that. And we can improve our chances. We can improve the chances of the survival of good people and good families that we'll have to rebuild after this god-awful catastrophic event that is not totally impossible. So basically, through your knowledge and your level of preparedness, you've increased your chances of surviving a nuclear war. So, and to talk about such a grim subject, I always talk about grim subjects, but this is a particularly grim one, but it's there. So, till next time, this is Indiana Jim for Life and Freedom. Stay safe out there.